They always said an Omega should know her place. I had heard that sentence so many times it had stopped sounding like a warning. It had started sounding like a wall. Something solid. Something you were meant to press your spine against until you disappeared into the stone of it. My mother said it to me with love. The way people who have been hurt by the world try to hand you their armor before you've even been struck. My pack elders said it with the calm certainty of people who believe the order of things is natural and therefore kind. My supervisor said it the way she said everything, as instruction, not cruelty, and I believed them. For a long time, I believed them completely. My name is Ren. I am 23 years old. I carry plates for a living. And up until 3 weeks ago, that was the entire sum of what I let myself. The Crescent Hall banquet was not a place for someone like me to have opinions, or feelings, or reflexes that hadn't been pre-approved. It was a place where I moved silently between tables draped in white linen, where the candles smelled of cedar and warm amber, where the laughter of alphas rose into the vaulted ceiling like smoke no one ever thought to clear. My uniform was a plain gray dress and a white apron, and I had learned early the best version of myself in that room was the one nobody noticed. I had worked the banquet circuit for 2 years. Every formal gathering the Northern Packs threw, every territorial summit, every season feast held in a venue grand enough to remind the people inside it of their own importance. My supervisor was a broad-shouldered beta woman named Dagna. She'd hired me because I was, in her words, quiet, quick, and forgettable. She meant it as a compliment. I took it as a job description. And I tried very hard not to think about the fact that being forgettable had once been the thing I feared most in the world, and somewhere along the way had become the thing I leaned on hardest. The Crescent Hall sat at the edge of Thornwall City, perched above the river like something out of a story that belonged to someone else. On the night of the Convergence Feast, the yearly gathering, where all 4 Alpha territories sent representatives to swear their alliances still held, the hall had been dressed to intimidate. Dark floral arrangements rose from every surface, black-petaled, architectural. The chandeliers had been fitted with low amber bulbs that made everyone look lit from within by something ancient and just barely held in place. The scent of pine resin and mulled wine hung heavy and sweet, and underneath it ran something sharper, power, tension, the specific electricity that fills a room when too many dominant wolves gather in one place, and none of them fully trust each other, and all of them have to pretend they do. I'd been assigned the eastern corridor of tables, the ones closest to the raised platform where the Alpha King's party would sit. I didn't ask for that assignment. Dagna gave it to me because I was steady-handed, she said. Because I didn't spill. Because I didn't stare. 3 qualities she valued in a waitress. 3 qualities I had cultivated with the quiet discipline of a person who has learned that drawing attention in the wrong direction, in a room like that one, is never worth whatever small thing caused it. The first hour passed without incident. I carried trays of roasted herb bread and salted butter, refilled crystal goblets with dark red wine, moved between shoulders and chair backs with the practiced silence of someone who reads the geography of a room the way other people read a clock, which gaps to slip through, which conversations to skirt, which table to approach from the left because the man seated there gestures wide when he talks and has already knocked over one goblet and blamed the nearest server for it. These were the calculations of my working life. Small, constant, and completely invisible to the people they protected. I noticed other things too. the way I always did. The way certain betas leaned a fraction away from their alpha counterparts when they spoke. Just enough distance to signal deference without the embarrassment of an actual bow. The way the delegation from the Western Territory, 4 of them, all in dark copper and bronze, had set their backs to the wall, watching the room, not joining it, and the young server named Bram, 20 years old, 6 weeks into this work. The way he kept his eyes on the floor a beat too long whenever a dominant wolf passed him. The specific posture of someone who has learned submission as a survival strategy and hasn't yet figured out how to wear it like it fits. I recognized it, because I had worn it myself. The air shifted about 2 minutes before the main doors opened. I felt it before I understood it. A change in pressure. Subtle. Unmistakable. The way a room feels right before a real storm, when the atmosphere quietly rearranges itself around what's coming. The conversations didn't stop. The music didn't falter. But something adjusted. And every wolf in that hall felt it. And the whole room straightened without a single person deciding to. Then he walked in. I had heard about the Alpha King of the Northern Highlands the way you hear about weather. Through other people's reactions to it. Through the way everyone around you begins to move differently. Through the particular quality of silence that falls over a crowded space when something genuinely powerful steps into it. I'd served enough packed rooms to think I understood what alpha authority looked like. The way it organized space around itself. The way it made other dominant personalities recalibrate without meaning to. I was not ready for how completely, how immediately it was true of him. He was taller than I'd imagined, which was saying something, because I'd imagined him considerable. He moved through the entrance with the unhurried certainty of a man who has never once had to wonder whether he'd be given room. And the room gave it. Freely. Instantly. Understood what he was before his name was even announced. Dark braids pulled back from a face that was all clean angles and cool assessment. Pale blue eyes sweeping the hall, not arriving in it, cataloging it. Black leather fitted across shoulders, broad enough to make the fur trim look practical instead of decorative. The scars on his forearms were visible, unremarked, worn the way everything else about him was worn, without apology. And without explanation. His name was Alaric. And behind him, 2 steps back and to his left, walked a woman. I understood immediately to be someone who mattered. She was elegant in the way that only time and survived difficulty can produce. Silver threaded through dark hair, coiled precisely at the nape of her neck. A deep burgundy dress with long sleeves, a posture so correct it seemed almost architectural. Lady Iselda, the Alpha King's mother, and she moved into that room with a quiet gravity that made her in some strange way more noticeable than the power walking ahead of her. Where he commanded attention through sheer force, she commanded it through something harder to name. A stillness, the particular confidence of a woman who has already survived the worst things a life can hand you and found herself still standing on the other side of them. I watched her the way I watched most things in that hall. Carefully, from the edge, cataloging without attaching. I was refilling a water goblet at the foot of the platform steps when it happened. And I almost missed it. I was half-turned, reaching for the carafe on the side table, when I caught the movement in the corner of my eye. Not the swing itself, not yet, but the intention of it. The specific gathering of energy in a body that has already made a decision. A woman in a copper-colored dress, part of the Western delegation, She had risen from her seat with a smile arranged carefully across her face. She was already close to Lady Iselda. Too close. Moving with that deliberate casualness people use when they want a motion to look like an accident, right up until the moment it isn't. Her arm was already rising. I don't remember deciding to move. That is the honest truth of it. There was no calculation. No moment where I weighed the cost against the act. My body simply moved. The way it moves when something hot gets too close to bare skin. Pure reflex overriding every carefully built instinct toward invisibility I had spent 2 years perfecting. The impact landed across my forearm. Flat, sharp, startling in its force, and the silence that followed was immediate and total. Not the polite quiet between courses. This was the held-breath silence of 200 wolves all processing something at once that had no protocol for it. An Omega server had physically stepped between a raised hand and the Alpha King's mother. The carafe was somehow still in my other hand. The wine had sloshed in a dark arc across my white apron. It was dripping now, slow, red, onto the pale marble at my feet. The woman in the copper dress stared at me. Shock first, then something hotter and harder underneath it. I turned slowly, because every instinct still working was insisting I be very, very deliberate with my movements right now. Lady Iselda was looking at me, with an expression it took me a moment to name, because I so rarely had it aimed at me. Genuine, unhurried attention, as though I were something worth the full cost of a look. And then I felt it, the weight of a gaze that carries authority in it. I made myself look up. Alaric had not moved from the head of the platform. He hadn't needed to. The room had rearranged itself around the moment, and he stood at the dead center of it, completely still. Pale blue eyes fixed on me, with an expression I could not read, which frightened me more than anything else in that room, precisely because I could not read it. Dagna materialized at my elbow within seconds. Her fingers closed around my arm with a grip that was professional and desperate in equal measure. Step back. She breathed it against my ear. Step back. Be quiet, and do not say one single word. I let her move me. I kept my eyes down. I let the room begin to breathe again around me. Let the voices find their careful rhythm. Let the machinery of the feast restart itself the way people do when they understand that certain things are better absorbed and moved past than looked at directly. But as Dagna steered me toward the corridor door, I made a mistake. I glanced back. Alaric was still watching me. He had not looked away. Not once. Across the entire length of that hall, through the resumed motion of servers and the resumed noise of conversation, his pale eyes were still fixed on the place where I had been standing. Tracking the path Dagna was walking me down, with an expression that was not anger, not amusement, not the cold dismissal I would have found easiest to survive. It was something closer to calculation, something closer to interest. The corridor door swung shut behind me, and I stood in the narrow service hallway with my wine-stained apron and my aching forearm and my heart working far too hard for someone who was supposed to be invisible. And I thought, you have done something you cannot undo. The next morning, a sealed letter arrived at the staff quarters, addressed in my name, written in a hand I didn't recognize, pressed with a wax mark I had only ever seen on official Northern Highland documents. I stared at it for a long time before I opened it. Report to the King's Hall at noon. Do not be late. No signature, no explanation, no indication of what waited on the other side. of that instruction. Only the certainty, settling cold and quiet into the pit of my stomach, that whatever came next was already in motion. I changed my apron 3 times that morning. Not because the first 2 were stained. They weren't. I had scrubbed the wine out the night before, working the fabric in the small stone sink until the water ran clear and my hands went raw from the cold. The aprons were fine. I kept changing them because standing in front of that narrow mirror and adjusting the ties gave my hands something to do. And my hands very badly needed something to do. Bram found me in the hallway at 11:30. I was leaning against the wall outside the linen closet with the sealed letter still folded in my pocket. Even though I had read it 11 times and long since memorized all 8 of its words. He was 20, slight in the way young beta males sometimes are before their secondary traits settle in. An honest face. The kind of eyes that always looked a little worried, even when nothing was wrong. And he'd been worried since he heard about last night. Which meant his expression that morning was doing something complicated. I didn't have the room in me to read. They're saying the Western delegation filed a formal grievance. No preamble. Bram had never learned the art of easing into hard news. Against you, for interference. I looked at him. A grievance. With the Convergence Council. He hesitated. Dagna's been in her office since 7. She won't open the door. I let that settle. The Convergence Council was the body that governed conduct between packs at sanctioned events. A council of elders and representatives whose whole reason for existing, as far as I'd ever understood it, was to make sure no action at a formal gathering could be read as an act of aggression between territories. A waitress stepping between a raised hand and the Alpha King's mother was apparently exactly the kind of thing that required documentation. Filed by whom? I asked. Lady Thorne. He said the name carefully. The way you say the name of something you're not sure is safe to say out loud. The woman in the copper dress. She's the Western Alpha's cousin. He swallowed. She's saying you assaulted her. And there it was. The word landed with the specific weight of something absurd that has nonetheless been made official. I had blocked a slap, and I was now apparently a documented aggressor at an Interpack summit. Go back to your shift, I told him. Ren, please. I'll be fine. I said it quietly, the way I said most things. He looked at me a moment longer than was comfortable, and I watched him do the arithmetic that kind young people do when they want to help and understand. They can't. The quiet math of helplessness. Then he nodded once and walked back toward the kitchens. I straightened my apron. I checked the letter one more time, as though the words might have rearranged themselves overnight into something less irreversible. They hadn't. I walked to the King's Hall. Thornwall in the gray morning light was a different place than it was under the amber chandeliers. The streets between the staff quarters and the King's Hall were cobbled and steep, lined with buildings of dark stone that had been old for a very long time and seemed comfortable with it. The river was audible from almost everywhere, a low constant presence beneath the sound of market stalls, opening, and cart wheels on stone. The air smelled of wood smoke and bread from the bakeries lifting their shutters, and under that the mineral cold of the river, and under that pine, always pine, this far into Highland territory, as though the forest had laid a permanent claim on the very air. I walked with my hands clasped in front of me, my eyes ahead, and I tried very hard not to think about the grievance, or about Dagna behind her closed door, or about the particular quality of a pair of pale blue eyes that had followed me across a silent hall. The King's Hall was not the Crescent Hall, where the Crescent Hall had been built for ceremony. The King's Hall had been built for the business of governance. A wide, dark building of fitted stone, high, narrow windows set at the center of the city, on a slight rise that meant you were always walking uphill to reach it. The effect, I suspected, was entirely on purpose. 2 guards in Northern Highland black flanked the entrance. They looked at me when I arrived, then at each other, then back at me, with the expression of men who had been told to expect someone and were reconciling what they'd been told with what they were seeing. "Wren," I said. "I was summoned." The older one, jaw like a shelf, checked a list, found my name, stepped aside without a word. Inside the King's Hall smelled of old paper and leather and something faintly metallic I'd always associated with authority. The corridor I was sent down was wide and lined with maps. Enormous detailed territorial maps in dark frames, each one marked with boundary lines and pack sigils in faded ink. I kept my eyes on them as I walked, because looking at maps felt safer than thinking about where I was going. I had always loved maps. That was a thing I didn't say out loud anymore. The door at the end of the corridor stood open. I stopped in the doorway, because my feet made the decision before the rest of me caught up. The room was a study, large, book-lined, the kind of room that has been used rather than decorated. Papers in organized layers across the desk, a globe on a stand near the window, and more maps on these walls too, except these had been marked in fresh ink recently updated, notes in handwriting too small to read from where I stood. Alaric was standing with his back to me, looking out the tall window at the city below. I was in simpler clothing than the night before. Dark trousers, a black shirt sleeves rolled to the elbow. No fur, no armor, no presentation. It should have made him seem smaller. It didn't. If anything, stripped of the ceremony, the authority was more visible. The way pulling scaffolding off a finished building reveals the structure underneath. He didn't turn when I entered, but he spoke immediately. "Close the door." His voice was lower than I expected, not softer. Nothing about it suggested accommodation, but lower, with a resonance that settled into the room like a second kind of gravity. I closed the door. My hands were steady. I was very proud of my hands in that moment. "You know why you're here," he said, still not turning. "Lady Thorne filed a grievance," I said, "against me. She filed it within an hour of the incident." He turned then, and I made myself hold my ground, which took more effort than I'd have liked to admit in the gray morning light, without the amber warmth of the banquet. He looked sharper, the pale eyes cooler, the angles of his face more pronounced, and he was looking at me with the same unreadable expression from the night before, the one I still couldn't name. "She's calling it assault, unprovoked physical contact with a representative of an allied territory." The absurdity of it rose in my throat. I pressed it down. "I blocked a slap," I said. My voice came out steadier than I felt. "One that was aimed at your mother." Something moved across his expression. Quick, controlled, gone before I could catch it. "I know what you did," he said. "I was in the room." "Then you know it wasn't unprovoked." The silence that followed had weight to it. He studied me for a long moment, the kind of study that makes you aware of every specific thing about yourself. The plainness of the gray dress, the single braid of pale hair over one shoulder, the wine stain that hadn't quite come out of the apron hem, the way I was clasping my hands in front of me, the same way I always did when I was trying to look calmer than I was. "Sit down," he said. It wasn't a request, but it also wasn't quite what I'd been bracing for. I sat in the chair across from the desk. He stayed standing, which meant I had to look up at him, which I suspected was not an accident. Lady Thorne's grievance was reviewed by the Convergence Council this morning, he said. They've determined the incident falls in a gray area of the conduct statutes. Physical intervention at a formal gathering, regardless of intent. My stomach dropped. Gray area meaning that under normal circumstances you'd be facing a formal censure and a permanent ban from every sanctioned PAC event. He paused. These are not normal circumstances. I waited. My mother, he said, and something in his voice shifted very slightly, like a door opening a fraction in a wall that was otherwise solid, has requested that the grievance be dismissed, on the grounds that what you did was protection, not aggression. I exhaled. The council, he went on, does not dismiss grievances at the request of individuals, regardless of rank, including mine. Another pause. This one had a different quality. Deliberate. Considered. Which means the grievance stays active, and you remain in a complicated position. What does that mean for me? I asked. He looked at me steadily. It means I have a proposal. Outside the tall window, the city moved through its gray morning, indifferent to the suspended thing happening in a book-lined study above it. The river ran, the market stalls opened, the pine-cold air moved through the streets the way it always had. Inside the room I sat very still, and waited to hear what the Alpha King of the Northern Highlands considered a proposal. And I thought with a clarity that surprised me, whatever it is. Something has already changed. The only question is what it changes into. The proposal was not what I expected. I had braced myself in the 30 seconds between his last word and whatever came next for something transactional. Something cold. A legal arrangement. A statement I'd be made to sign. Perhaps a scripted account of the night that could be handed to the council as counter-evidence. Something administrative. Something that kept me at the correct distance from anything that mattered. What he said was, I want you on staff. Here, in the King's Hall. I stared at him. Temporarily, he added, in the tone of a man who has learned to qualify a statement not because he doubts it, but because he understands how it lands. Until the council closes the file, my mother has made an argument that the most effective defense against the censure is demonstrated trust, that the household of the Alpha King does not consider you a threat, that we have in fact chosen to employ you. Your mother made this argument, I said. She's persuasive. It wasn't quite dry. Wasn't quite warm. Landed somewhere in between, and I didn't know what to do with it. I looked down at my hands, then back up, because looking down felt like conceding something I hadn't decided to concede yet. What would the position be? Household staff. You'd be assigned to the residential wing. Correspondence, receiving callers, general support for my mother's schedule while she remains in Thornwall for the season. He paused. You'd be given proper quarters. Your work with the banquet circuit would be suspended for the duration. I thought about Dagna behind her closed door. I thought about Bram's worried face in the hallway. I thought about the word assault attached to my name in a council document sitting in a file somewhere in this very building. Patient and permanent. And if I decline? I asked. The question cost me something. I felt it leave my mouth and understood at once that it was the kind of question that declares a position. That I was someone who needed to know the shape of a choice before making it, even when the alternative was almost certainly worse. Something shifted in his expression. Not displeasure. Something closer, faint, and brief to recognition. If you decline, he said, the grievance proceeds through standard channels. The council will likely rule in Lady Thorne's favor, given the pressures involved. You'll be censured, barred from sanctioned events. A pause. I won't compel you. That is not what this is. And I believed him. I wasn't entirely sure why. I had known him less than 20 minutes across 2 encounters. But the statement had the texture of something he meant, rather than something he was saying for effect. And I had spent enough time reading rooms and people to know the difference. I'll need to collect my things, I said. He nodded once, already turning back toward the desk. Someone will take you. Be back before the evening session. I stood. I straightened my apron out of pure habit, then felt faintly absurd for doing it. Do I call you? I asked. He looked up from the papers he'd already begun reviewing. The pale eyes held something that might in a different face have been amusement. Alaric, he said. In this hall, titles are for formal sessions, not for passing. I nodded. I walked to the door. My hand was on the frame when his voice reached me. Quieter than before. A different quality to it. Less instruction, more something else. You didn't flinch, he said. Last night, when you stepped in. I didn't turn around. I know. Most people would have. I know that too, I said. And I walked out. Before the conversation could become something I didn't yet have the vocabulary to navigate. The residential wing of the King's Hall was nothing like the staff quarters I'd lived in for 2 years. It wasn't excessive. I want to be clear about that. Because excessive would have been easier to hold at arm's length. Easier to dismiss as the performance of wealth. The room I was given was large by any standard I'd ever applied to rooms. A window that looked south over the river. Walls of warm, dark stone, hung with tapestries in deep green and brown that soaked up the gray morning light and turned it somehow into amber. The bed had a proper frame. Linen that smelled of lavender. A writing desk. A small bookshelf half full of volumes that had clearly been read rather than displayed. I sat on the edge of that bed for a moment after the guard left, and I tried to locate myself inside the sequence of events that had produced this particular room, this particular morning, this particular version of my life. 24 hours earlier, I had been carrying a carafe of water toward an unremarkable table at the edge of a banquet hall. I unpacked my single bag with the efficiency of someone accustomed to not having much to unpack. Lady Azelde found me that same afternoon. I was in the small anteroom off her private sitting room, a space stacked with correspondence that apparently needed organizing, a task that had been described to me as my primary responsibility and that I was approaching with the focused attention I gave to anything I could actually control. I sorted the letters by territory of origin, then by date received, then cross-referenced each against a ledger recording which had gotten formal replies and which were still pending. It was meticulous and quiet, and I was deeply grateful for it. I heard her before I saw her. The precise, unhurried sound of footsteps that know exactly where they're going. She appeared in the doorway, took in the organized stacks, with an expression I could only describe as satisfaction. You sorted by territory, she said, and chronologically within each section. I can reorganize if you prefer a different system. I've been asking for someone to sort that correspondence for 3 weeks, she said, moving into the room with the ease of a woman entirely at home in it. The last 2 assistants filed everything by the color of the envelope seal, which tells me a great deal about how they approached problems in general. She settled into the chair near the window. The good chair, the one place to catch the most light, which told me she spent real time in this room. And she looked at me with the same unhurried attention she'd aimed at me in the banquet hall. Up close, she was more vivid than she'd seemed at a distance. The silver in her hair caught the light. Her eyes were a darker blue than her son's, warmer at the edges. "How is your arm?" she asked. The question surprised me into honesty. "Sore," I said. "It's fine. It isn't nothing. What you did." She said it plainly. "I want you to understand that I know that." I looked at the letter in my hands, set it carefully on the correct stack. "I reacted," I said. "I didn't think about it." "No," she agreed. "That's precisely why it means what it means." I didn't know what to do with that, so I said nothing, which seemed to be acceptable. She didn't press. She sat in her chair and watched the river through the window. And I went back to the correspondence. And the room was quiet in a way that felt strangely like it had been quiet together before. "Lady Thorne," she said after a while, "has been a problem for longer than one evening." I kept my eyes on the letters. "That isn't my business." "No," she agreed, "but it's your context. You should have it." She folded her hands in her lap, with the same composed deliberateness her son used when he wanted to be precise. "There are people," she said, "who look at a woman standing alone and see an opportunity rather than a person. I have spent a great many years being looked at that way. I learned early to make myself difficult to read, to take up exactly as much space as safety allowed, and no more." She turned from the window, looked at me directly. "I recognized it in you the moment you moved. That is a thing you learn to see in others. You have worn it yourself." The correspondence went still in my hands, because I had spent 2 years being certain that no one saw it. That the whole point of the gray dress and the lowered eyes and the practiced smallness was that no one saw it. And here was a woman in burgundy silk, at the top of the only world I had ever known, telling me she had seen it in the space of a single second. "I'm not anyone," I said, quietly, before I could stop myself. Lady Iselda looked at me for a long moment. "That she said is the most dangerous thing anyone has ever taught you to believe." She rose from her chair with the unhurried grace that seemed to be her natural state of motion, moved toward the door, paused at the threshold, turned back. "Dinner is at 7, in the main hall. Staff eat in the east corridor." A pause. "But tonight Alaric has asked that you join the family table." I stared at her. "Never in 14 years, she said, has a member of staff sat at that table. I want you to understand the size of the thing you are walking into, and I want you to walk into it anyway." And she was gone. Before I could form a single word in response, I stood in the anteroom surrounded by organized correspondence and thought about a great many things at once. About Lady Thorne, and the raised arm, and the copper dress. About the council's open file, patient and permanent. About pale blue eyes in a gray morning study. And about a woman who had looked at me for 1 second in a crowded room and seen the whole architecture of a life spent disappearing. And then I thought dinner is at 7, and I thought I have nothing appropriate to wear. And then, underneath both of those, something quieter, something harder to look at directly, something that felt cautiously and against every instinct I had spent 23 years building, like the first edge of wanting to be seen. Dinner at the family table of the Alpha King turned out to be less ceremonial and more unsettling than I'd braced for. I had borrowed a dress From a woman named Petra, permanent household staff, mid-40s, short dark hair, and the specific no-nonsense warmth of someone who has worked a large house long enough to have seen everything twice and stopped being surprised by any of it. She'd appeared at my door at 6:30 with a dark navy dress over one arm and the expression of a person who had been briefed on my situation and formed a practical opinion about it. "It'll run a little long on you," she said, assessing me with the frank efficiency of someone taking measurements. "But it's appropriate. That's what matters tonight." "Does this happen often?" I asked, pulling the dress on behind the partition. "Staff at the family table? Never. No drama. In 14 years. Not once." I came out from behind the partition. She looked at me, made a small sound of professional satisfaction, adjusted the shoulder seam with 2 quick movements of her hands. "Is that supposed to make me feel better?" I asked. "It's supposed to make you feel informed," she said. "There's a difference. Head up, shoulders back." And I thought about that distinction the whole walk to the main hall. Feeling better, and feeling informed. It seemed like the kind of thing that mattered in a place like this. The family table was set in a smaller dining room off the main hall, a room I hadn't seen yet. Warmer, lower ceiling, a fireplace that was actually being used, and dark wood furniture that showed the honest wear of regular meals rather than occasional ceremony. It smelled of roasted meat and something herbed and faintly sweet. And the fire turned everything amber. And for one disorienting second, it reminded me of the banquet hall. Except that almost everything about it was the opposite of the banquet hall. Intimate instead of vast. Functional instead of performative. A room where the people actually lived, rather than appeared. 4 people were already seated when I arrived. Lady Isolde at the near end, who acknowledged my entrance with a small nod that managed to communicate both welcome and the information that I should stop hesitating in the doorway. Alaric at the head, a document still in his hand which he set down with what looked like conscious effort when I came in. As though putting it away was an act that required a decision rather than a reflex. And 2 others I hadn't met. The first was a young man of maybe 25. Lean where his brother was broad. Same dark coloring. Entirely different energy. Where Alaric organized a room through gravity, this one animated it, like a fire that had decided to take a more social form. He looked at me when I entered with open, uncomplicated curiosity. "So you're Wren," he said. "Ferris. I'm the less intimidating brother, which granted is a low bar." "Sit down, Ferris," Alaric said, without looking up. "I am sitting down." "You're performing sitting down. There's a difference." I sat in the empty chair between Lady Isolde and the 4th person at the table. A woman about 30. Warm brown skin. Dark eyes that took my measure with a calm professional interest that reminded me immediately of the way Dagna used to look at new staff. Strong hands, the posture of someone who spent real time in physical training. The Northern Highland sigil clasped at her collar. "Sorrel," she said, "head of the King's personal guard." A pause. "I know who you are. Everyone seems to." "You're the first Omega to physically intervene in a territorial incident at a convergence summit," she said. "In recorded history. People tend to know who's first." I picked up the water glass in front of me and drank from it, because it gave my hands something appropriate to do. Dinner moved with a rhythm I hadn't expected. Not stiff, not formal, but not entirely relaxed either. There was a current underneath it, a careful quality to certain exchanges, the kind that exists in a household where significant things are happening, and the people at the table are managing the balance between ordinary life and the weight of those significant things. Ferris talked more than anyone, with the practiced ease of someone who had long ago accepted the role of social lubricant and made a genuine craft of it. Sorrel ate with focused efficiency and spoke seldom but precisely when she did. And Lady Ezeld asked me 3 questions over the course of the meal. About where I'd grown up, about how long I'd worked the banquet circuit, about whether I had always been good at organizing information, and each one landed with the quality of something that had been considered before it was asked. I answered the first one carefully, told her I'd grown up in a border territory on the eastern edge of the Highlands, and I watched something flicker across her face when I said it. Brief, filed away, gone before I could decide whether I'd imagined it. Alaric said very little for most of the meal. I was aware of him the way you're aware of something at the edge of your sight. Not because I was looking at him, but because the room was organized around him in a way that made not being aware of him a kind of active effort. When he did speak, the table's attention shifted to him, with the natural unforced quality of water finding its level. Halfway through the second course, Ferris said, "The council meets again tomorrow morning. About the Thorn grievance." The quality of the room changed. "I know," Alaric said. "There's pressure from the Western delegation. They want a ruling before the end of Convergence Week." "I know that too. They're saying if the council dismisses it without formal consequence, the Western Alpha will read it as the Northern House protecting one of its own. At the expense of—" Alaric's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "I'm aware." Ferris subsided. Not with the wounded compliance of someone who'd been silenced, but with the easy acceptance of someone who had made his point and was satisfied to have made it. He glanced at me, briefly, not with pity, with something more complicated and more honest. The look of a person who wants you to understand something without being the one to say it out loud. I understood it. The grievance wasn't going away easily. My being here helped, but it wasn't a solution. It was a counterweight, temporary, and the scale it was balanced against was heavier than anyone at that table was saying. After the meal, as the plates were cleared, and Lady Iselda had moved to the chair near the fire with a book she clearly had no intention of reading, Alaric said my name. Just that. "Wren." I stopped at the edge of the doorway, where I'd been intending to make a quiet exit. "Yes, walk with me." And I was starting to understand that very few things he said were requests, but that there was a distinction which I was also starting to identify between the things that were instructions and the things that were something else and simply used the same grammatical shape. This was the something else. We walked the outer corridor of the residential wing, the one lined with those territorial maps I'd noticed the first day. Night had come down fully outside the narrow windows, the corridor lit by wall lamps that turned the stone warm. He walked slower than I expected from a man his size, and I walked beside him. Not quite at his shoulder, not quite behind him. An in-between distance I hadn't consciously chosen, but that seemed to be what the space between us produced on its own. He didn't speak for almost a full minute. I had learned over the course of one day that his silences were not empty. They were occupied, working silences, and interrupting them was the wrong instinct. "The council will like rule against you," he said finally. "Tomorrow, or the day after. Lady Thorne's family holds 2 council seats through the Western Alliance structure. The votes are already spoken for." I assumed something like that. "A censure can be appealed," he said, But an appeal takes time and requires a formal sponsor from a ranked household. I looked at the maps as we passed them. The Northern Highlands were vast on paper, all that territory marked and named and bounded. The kind of space that requires a different relationship with distance than anything I'd grown up understanding. Except I had grown up understanding distance. On the eastern edge of exactly this territory. I just didn't say so. "Are you offering to sponsor an appeal?" I asked. "I'm telling you the mechanism exists," he said. "Whether I offer it depends on something I want to ask you." I stopped walking. He stopped a half step later, turned to look at me, and in the warm lamplight he looked different than he had in the gray morning study. Less sharp, the pale eyes less cool, the angles of his face holding something the daylight had kept controlled. "Ask," I said. "Why did you step in?" He asked it the way he said most things. Directly. Without the softening most people use to make a hard question easier to refuse. Not the reflex of it. "You told me that already. I mean, why you, specifically? An Omega server, in a room full of ranked wolves, any of whom could have, should have. Why did your body move when no one else's did?" The question landed somewhere deep and inconvenient. I thought about it honestly, the way I rarely let myself think about the things I do without deciding to. Because examining an instinct too closely has a way of either validating it or dismantling it. And I had generally preferred not to know which. "Because she looked like someone who had already survived a great deal," I said finally. "Your mother. And because I thought I don't know, that she shouldn't have to survive this one too. Not in a room full of people who were supposed to be protecting her." The corridor was very quiet. Alaric looked at me for a long moment, and something in his expression moved. Not the controlled, quick movement I'd seen in the study. Something slower, less guarded. Something that came from somewhere real, and didn't fully retract before I saw it. "She raised me alone," he said, "after my father. There were people then, too, who thought her position made her a useful target." I didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. The sentence completed itself in the space between us, in the specific quality of a silence shared between two people who have both, in very different rooms, understood what it means to be the one who doesn't get protected. "I'll sponsor the appeal," he said, "regardless of how the council rules." He turned, walked back the way we'd come, and I stood in the corridor alone, with the warmth of the lamps and the vast mapped territories on the walls, and something shifting quietly in my chest that I was not yet ready to name, but could no longer honestly pretend wasn't there. The council ruled against me on a Thursday. I knew before the notification came. Sorrel told me at breakfast, with the directness I'd come to expect from her. The kind that hands you hard information without decoration. Because she believed correctly that people deserve to know what's coming toward them with enough time to prepare. Censor. Formal, documented, barred from all sanctioned PAC events for 18 months. My name entered into the council's conduct record, alongside Lady Thorne's account, which described me as an unpredictable and aggressive presence at a diplomatic gathering. Bram sent a letter that arrived the same morning. Short, slightly smudged the way his writing always was when he wrote quickly. "I know it isn't fair. I'm sorry. I hope wherever you land next is better than where you've been." I folded it and kept it. Alaric filed the appeal that same afternoon, under something called the Household Protection Doctrine, which sent the matter above the Convergence Council entirely, to the Highland Elder Assembly, a longer process but a different voting structure, and the Western delegation held no seats there. Ferris told me this, appearing in the doorway of the anteroom with 2 cups of tea and the expression of a man who has decided that solidarity is best expressed through beverage and proximity. He set 1 cup on the edge of the correspondence table without asking if I wanted it, which I appreciated more than I could have explained. Weeks, he said, when I asked how long. Maybe 2 months. The assembly won't even convene until the survey questions are settled. These things move slowly, on purpose. He wrapped both hands around his cup. Does that bother you? Staying that long? I thought about the question, honestly. 2 months ago, I'd have found it plainly frightening. Too long. Too exposed. Too far outside the carefully maintained smallness of my life. The staff quarters, and the banquet circuit, and the practiced invisibility that kept everything manageable. No, I said, and meant it. It doesn't. Ferris smiled. Not the easy social smile from the dinner table. Something smaller, and more genuine, underneath it. Good, he said, because you're the first person who's organized that correspondence correctly in 3 years, and my mother is insufferably pleased about it. The weeks that followed had a rhythm I hadn't expected to settle into so naturally. Mornings were correspondence and scheduling. Lady Iseld's calendar was complex, full of the specific obligations of a woman who held a significant social position with neither official title nor formal authority, which meant everything she did was done through relationship and presence rather than rank. And managing it required a kind of attention I'd never applied to anything before. She taught me most of it directly, without ceremony, sitting in her chair near the window while I worked, offering context when it was useful, asking my opinion with a consistency that weeks in still caught me slightly off guard every single time. Because I had not been in many rooms where my opinion was treated as a resource. And then, on a gray afternoon in the 3rd week, she told me something I hadn't asked for. We were alone in the anteroom, rain against the high windows. She was watching the river through the glass, the way she did when she was working her way toward something. I was younger than you are now, she said, when I married Alaric's father, and I was not in the beginning anyone, a minor daughter of a minor pack. Chosen, I was told, because I was quiet, because I did not make trouble, because I would know my place. She said the last 3 words, the way you set down something heavy. I went very still, because I knew those words. I had been raised on those words. I had built an entire life inside the shape of those words, and I had never once heard them come out of the mouth of a woman who lived at the top of the only world I knew. And when he died, she went on, I was 31, with 2 young sons, and a great many people who had spent years treating me as furniture, suddenly deciding I was a threat, or an opportunity, or an inconvenience to be managed. She turned from the window. I learned then, she said, that the smallness they praise in you, when you are useful, is the same smallness they will use against you the moment you are not. That being difficult to see keeps you safe right up until the moment it makes you disposable. I didn't say anything. My hands had stopped moving over the correspondence entirely. I raised my sons, she said, in a house that wanted to swallow all 3 of us. And I did it by refusing quietly every single day to be as small as I was told to be. It is the hardest thing I have ever done, and no one ever saw me do it. She looked at me then, directly, with that unhurried attention that always felt like the whole cost of a look. I saw you do it, in 1 second, in a crowded room, and I decided that whatever it cost you were not going to disappear back into the stone. The rain kept on against the windows, and I understood finally the thing I had been circling for 3 weeks, that this was not charity, that she had not requested my presence out of gratitude or politics or the tidy arithmetic of a useful counterweight. She had looked across a banquet hall and seen a younger version of herself, buried under a gray dress and a lifetime of being told to know her place. And she had reached back through 40 years to pull that girl out. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked, my voice not quite steady. "Because someone should have told me," she said, "and no one did." Afternoons sometimes took me to other parts of the hall, delivering documents to Sorrel's office in the Eastern Wing, where she would briefly and efficiently pull me into whatever logistical problem she was solving, treating my presence as simply part of the hall's machinery. The guards she commanded, 6 wolves all Highland ranked, had settled into an easy professional acknowledgement of me that I found steadying. They called me by name. They moved aside in corridors without the particular quality of deference that carries condescension inside it. And some evenings, not according to any schedule I could identify, Alaric would be in the library when I passed it. The library sat on the 2nd floor of the residential wing, a long room that smelled permanently of old paper and cedar, reading chairs near the windows, a standing desk in the corner, which was clearly where he worked when he wanted to work without being found. The first time I passed and saw the light under the door, I kept walking. The second time, I paused, without entirely deciding to. The third time he said, without looking up from whatever he was reading, "There's a chair," so I sat in it. We rarely talked at length on those evenings. He worked or read documents or stood at the window with the particular stillness of a man processing something he wasn't ready to voice. I read from the shelf, historical accounts, territorial records, and once or twice things that were simply stories, which surprised me, and which I didn't comment on. The silence between us had changed, from the weighted, careful silence of our early conversations, into something easier, not comfortable exactly, not yet, but no longer requiring active maintenance. A silence that had decided to exist without explaining itself. One night, perhaps 5 weeks in, he looked up from his desk. "What did you want to be?" he asked, before the banquet circuit. I looked up from the book in my lap. "A cartographer," I said, and watched something shift in his expression. "A cartographer," he repeated. "I grew up on the edge of things," I said. "The edges always seemed more interesting than the centers." I looked back at the book. It wasn't practical. "Most interesting things aren't." He was quiet a moment. "I'll have Sorrel pull the survey records for the eastern boundary," he said. "They need updating. The last formal survey was 8 years ago." Another pause. Quieter. "If you wanted to look at them." I looked at him. He had already returned his eyes to his document, in the particular way of a man who has said something he meant, and decided that looking away is the correct next move. "I'd like that," I said. The survey records arrived 2 days later. A thick, worn folio tied with cord, the paper gone soft at the edges. Sorrel set it on the correspondence table without comment, and told me it had come up from the archive that morning. And I opened it that evening alone in the anteroom, expecting nothing but the pleasure of maps. Except that isn't what I found. Because the eastern boundary was my boundary. The border territory I had grown up in. Named and bounded on paper I had never expected to hold. And I sat there for a long time, with my finger tracing the river I had grown up beside and the ridgeline I had learned to walk before I learned to read. And then I noticed something wrong. The boundary was drawn in the wrong place, not by a little. Not the kind of drift that comes from an old survey and shifting rivers. It was drawn a full valley to the west of where it belonged, cutting off a stretch of land that everyone I'd grown up with had always known to be Northern Highland ground, reassigning it on official paper stamped and sealed to territory that bordered the west. I knew that valley. I had walked it. I had watched the light move across it 1,000 mornings of my childhood. And someone had moved it. On the map. On purpose, I told Alaric that night, in the library. I set the folio open on his desk and put my finger on the valley and said, "This is wrong. This land is yours. I grew up here. I know where the line goes. And someone drew it in the wrong place." He looked at the map for a long time. Then he looked at me. 8 years ago, he said slowly, the Western delegation petitioned to have this exact stretch reassigned, on the grounds that a formal survey supported their claim. My father was still alive. He refused to acknowledge the survey. He died 4 months later, and the matter was never resolved. The room had gone very still. "Lady Thorne's grievance against you," he said, "isn't about a slap." And I felt the whole shape of the thing rearrange itself in front of me, because I hadn't blocked a moment of personal cruelty. I had walked blind into the middle of a plan 8 years in the making. A slow, patient effort to unsettle the Northern House, to provoke it, to create an incident that could be leveraged. And Lady Thorne's raised arm hadn't been temper. It had been the next move in a game I'd knocked a piece off of without even knowing the board existed. They needed the Northern House to overreact, Alaric said, to defend its own against the council and prove itself unreasonable. Instead, an Omega server blocked it, I said, and your mother asked for mercy, and the whole thing became a story about restraint instead of aggression. "You didn't just save my mother from a slap," he said, and there was something in his voice I hadn't heard before. "You broke the shape of the entire thing, without knowing you were doing it." I looked down at the map, at my valley, drawn in the wrong place by someone who had needed it to be somewhere else. And I thought, I have been invisible my entire life. And it turns out, the one time anyone truly failed to see me coming, it changed everything. We were still standing over the map when the door opened. It was Sorrel, and her face was wrong, because Sorrel's face was never wrong. Sorrel's face was a closed door in a stone wall, and now it was open. And what was behind it was alarm. "There's a problem," she said, "in the anteroom with the correspondence. A beat. You need to come now, both of you." The correspondence table was exactly as I'd left it. The organized stacks, the ledger, the lamp still burning, except one letter had been set apart from the others. On the corner of the table, addressed to Lady Iselde, in a hand I didn't recognize, and Sorrel was standing over it, not touching it, with 2 of her guards at the door and an expression I would remember for a long time. "Petra found it," she said, "during the evening sort. She noticed the seal was wrong, the wax color, so she didn't open it. She called me instead." "What is it?" Alaric asked. Sorrel looked at me. "When you sort my lady's correspondence," she said, "you open every letter, yourself, by hand, first, before anyone else touches it." "Yes," I said. That's how it's done. So nothing reaches her that shouldn't." "So you," Sorrel said quietly, "would have been the one to open this." and the room went cold, because I understood then what she was telling me, what Petra had seen, what the wrong-colored wax meant, that whatever was inside that letter had not been meant for Lady Isolde at all. It had been meant for the person whose job it was to open Lady Isolde's letters first. It had been meant for me, and I stood in the warm lamplight of the anteroom I had come to think of as the safest place in my entire life. And I looked at a letter with my death folded quietly inside it, and I understood that the game I'd knocked a piece off of had just decided to take one back. They opened the letter in a sealed room. Gloves, a cloth over the mouth and nose. Sorrel's steadiest guard, doing it with a pair of long iron tweezers, while the rest of us waited on the other side of a closed door, like people waiting on a diagnosis. The powder inside was fine and pale and almost nothing at all. Enough, Sorrel said afterward, to kill a person who breathed it in while leaning close over a letter. The way you lean close over a letter when you are checking a seal. When you are doing your job. When you are the first hand to touch the correspondence of the Alpha King's mother. The way I had leaned over 400 letters in 3 weeks. I sat in the anteroom for a long time after that, not moving, because moving felt like a decision, and I had lost temporarily my confidence in decisions. Lady Isolde found me there. She didn't say anything at first. She crossed the room. She sat in the good chair by the window, and she looked at me with an expression I had never seen on her. Not composed, not unhurried. Something underneath the architecture had cracked, and what showed through was fear and fury, and something that looked terribly like guilt. "I brought you into this house," she said. "You didn't put the powder in the envelope. I made you a target." Her voice did not rise. Isolde's voice never rose, but it thinned the way a wire thins under tension. "I looked at you across a room and I decided you were worth saving. And in saving you, I painted a mark on your back that was meant for mine. It was meant for whoever opened your letters," I said. "That would have been me either way. You didn't do that. I stopped, because my voice was doing something I didn't have permission for. "You're the first person in my whole life who looked at me and decided I was worth the trouble. Don't you dare apologize for that. Don't you dare." The rain had started again, against the high windows, and Isolde reached across the space between us and took my hand, and held it. The way you hold something you have decided quietly, and against all the odds of a hard life, not to lose. Alaric came for me at dawn. I hadn't slept. I don't think he had either. There was something in his face that had gone past anger into a stillness so complete it frightened me more than shouting would have. "I want to show you something," he said. He took me down to the archive. Below, the King's Hall. A cold stone room full of ledgers and folios and the smell of paper slowly turning to dust. And on a long table, he had laid out everything. The Eastern Boundary Survey, the one drawn in the wrong place. The Western Petition from 8 years ago. His father's refusal in his father's hand. And beside all of it, the letter. Sealed now in glass. The wrong-colored wax. "Someone in this hall handled that letter before it reached the anteroom," he said. "It didn't arrive with the day's post. It was placed. By someone who knew your routine. Someone who knew you open the correspondence first. Someone who had that information. Because they were told it. Or because they once held your job." The room went very quiet. Because I knew what he was saying before he finished saying it. Because there was exactly one person in the world who knew in precise detail how I sorted correspondence. Who had trained me to open every letter first. Who knew my habits the way you know the habits of someone you have watched work for 2 years? No, I said. Ren. She's a coward, I said. She's careful, and she's tired, and she taught me everything I know about disappearing. But she wouldn't. And I stopped. Because I heard myself. Because I was defending a woman who had spent 2 years teaching me to make myself small enough to survive. And I did not actually know what a frightened, tired, careful person would do if the Western delegation put enough weight on the other side of the scale. I did not actually know, and that was the worst part. They brought Dagna to the king's hall 3 days later. She looked smaller than I remembered, which was strange, because Dagna had always been the largest thing in any room she stood in. Broad-shouldered, certain. The woman who ran the banquet circuit, like a general runs a campaign. And now she stood in the middle of Alaric's study, with her hands folded in front of her, the way I fold mine. And I understood with a slow and terrible clarity that she had learned the same thing I had learned in the same school, from the same teachers. Knowing your place. I didn't know what was in it, she said, before anyone asked her anything. You have to believe that. I gave them your schedule, your routine, the seal colors. I told them how the correspondence moved through the anteroom. They said it was information, just information, for a diplomatic matter, and they paid me, and I told myself it couldn't be what it turned out to be. You told them I opened the letters first, I said. She looked at me, and her face broke. I told them everything about you, she whispered, because it was the easiest thing I had to sell. Because you were quiet, and quick, and forgettable. And I thought. Her voice cracked all the way through. I thought no one would ever miss you enough to ask. And there it was, the thing she had called a compliment, the thing she had hired me for, the thing I had built a life out of believing was safety. Quiet, quick, forgettable. She had looked at me for 2 years and seen exactly what everyone had always told me to be. And then she had sold it. Because a thing no one sees is a thing no one protects. And a thing no one protects is the easiest thing in the world to hand over. I should have hated her. I waited to hate her. I stood there, and I opened the door where the hatred was supposed to be. And what came out instead was grief. Because I knew that woman. I had been that woman. Frightened and tired, and told her whole life that her only value was in being small and useful and out of the way. And the Western delegation had found the exact pressure point that a lifetime of that teaching leaves behind. They hadn't corrupted her. They had simply believed the same thing about her that everyone had always believed about me. That she was disposable. And then they had used her like something disposable. And she had let them. Because no one had ever taught her she was anything else. Take her, Sorrel said quietly. And they did. The weeks after that did not move quickly. I had thought somehow that the poison would speed everything up, that a thing so ugly would force the world to hurry. It didn't. The assembly would not convene until the boundary question was settled. And the boundary question could only be settled one way. So I settled it. I spent 6 weeks doing the one thing I was better at than anyone in that hall. I resurveyed the eastern boundary. 3 field visits, Sorrel beside me on every one, treating each journey like a war. She intended to win. I walked the valley of my childhood with instruments in my hands and my father's country under my feet. And I drew it, correctly, where the line actually went. And when the survey was finished and submitted, The Highland Elder Assembly finally convened, in a chamber I had never expected to stand in. It was older than the Convergence Council's hall. Colder, stone-worn smooth by centuries of exactly this. 12 elders on a raised bench, and me in a plain, dark dress standing where a person stands when a room is going to decide what she is. The Western delegation was there. Not Lady Thorne herself, she had, Sorrel told me quietly. Left Thornwall weeks before, which told its own story. But her people, arranged along one wall in copper and bronze, watching. The way they had watched the whole banquet the night this began. And I understood standing there that I was not going to survive this by being small. Because smallness was the thing that had made me a target. Smallness was the thing Dagna had sold. Smallness was the thing that let a plan 8 years in the making decide I was a piece it could take off the board without anyone noticing. Smallness had kept me alive for 23 years, and it was going to bury me now if I let it. So I did not let it. When the assembly asked me to speak, I did not fold my hands and lower my eyes and take up exactly as much space as safety allowed. I laid my maps on the bench. 8 years ago, I said someone drew this boundary in the wrong place, a full valley to the west of where it belongs, and they submitted it as a formal survey, to take land that was never theirs. The Alpha King's father refused it, and 4 months later, he was dead, and the matter was buried. I put my finger on the valley. I grew up here, I said, on this exact stretch of ground that a piece of paper says belongs to the West. I learned to walk this ridge before I learned to read, and I am telling you as the person who has now surveyed it properly, that the paper is a lie. It has always been a lie. And it was the beginning of everything that has happened since. The grievance against me, and the letter that came after it. I looked up at the 12 elders. I was hired for 2 years, I said, on the strength of being forgettable. And a great many people are alive, right now, precisely because I was standing in a place no one thought to look. So I would ask this assembly to consider very carefully what it costs a territory to decide that some people are too small to see. Because the West made that decision about me. And it is the only reason I am the one standing here, telling you the truth. Iseld spoke after me. She was not required to. A woman of her standing had every reason to stay silent, to let the maps and the poison and the survey make the case to protect the careful neutral distance that a life at the top of that world had taught her to keep. She stood up anyway. I have held my tongue in this chamber for 30 years, she said. It is the price of surviving in it. Today I am going to pay a different price. And she told them, all of it. The younger version of herself chosen for being quiet. The husband who died. The years of being treated as furniture, and then as a threat. The decades of refusing quietly every day to be as small as she was told to be. I have never once been protected by this assembly, she said. I have only ever been managed by it. And I am telling you now, on the record, in front of every person who has spent years looking past me, that this girl saw me, when no one in this room ever has. And I will not sit down and let you file her away as an incident. She is the reason I am alive, and she is the truest thing that has walked into that hall in 30 years. She sat down, and the silence that followed was the silence of a room that has just watched a woman set fire to her own careful survival. On purpose. For someone else. The assembly ruled 6 days later. The censure overturned. My conduct record cleared. Lady Thorne's grievance formally dismissed on the grounds of demonstrated malicious intent. The eastern boundary restored to the maps it had been stolen off of. The valley of my childhood given back its true name. And a formal inquiry opened into the Western delegation's conduct, which would over the following season collapse their entire alliance structure under the weight of its own overextension. 3 territories withdrawing within the same year, for separate reasons that all traced back to the same pattern. The one that had produced Lady Thorne, and the copper dress, and the raised arm. Sorrel told me the ruling herself, over breakfast, with an expression that in her controlled economy of feeling passed for something close to joy. Ferris celebrated by appearing at the anteroom door with a honey cake that he claimed was a traditional Highland acknowledgement, and that Petra had quite obviously made herself that morning. We ate it over the correspondence table while Iselda pretended to disapprove, and failed completely. There was one more thing. They asked me what should be done with Dagna. I had a right to speak to it. The assembly granted me that. The woman who had sold my routine to people who tried to kill me with it. My testimony would shape what happened to her. And there was a version of me, a younger version, a version still pressed flat against the stone, who would have wanted to watch her destroyed. Who would have earned it? Who would have been entitled to every ounce of it? I stood in front of the assembly, and I did not ask for that. She was taught the same thing I was taught, I said. Her whole life. That her only value was in being small and useful and out of the way. And the people who used her believed exactly what she'd been trained to believe about herself. That she was disposable. I paused. I am not asking you to excuse what she did. She has to answer for it. But I am asking you not to answer it the way she was raised to expect. Because I have learned something these last weeks. That the way you break that lesson is by refusing once to pass it down. Because I thought I could not undo what she had done to me. But I could refuse to become the next hand in a long chain of people, teaching each other that some lives are worth less than others. Dagna was removed from the banquet circuit and barred from sanctioned work for 5 years. Not destroyed, not disappeared. Answerable and alive to become something else if she chose to. Which was more mercy than the world had ever shown either of us. She wrote to me once, months later. 4 lines. Slightly smudged the way careful people write when their hands are shaking. I spent 2 years looking at you and never once saw you. You looked at me for 1 minute and saw everything. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Thank you. I folded it, and I kept it. In the same place I kept Bram's letter. Because some things you keep. Not because they don't hurt, but because they're true. Bram was hired to the King's Hall permanent staff that spring. I mentioned his name to Petra in passing. Described his steadiness, his honest face, the way he'd once stood in a hallway with nothing useful to offer, and offered his presence anyway, which I had come to understand was not a small thing at all. He arrived nervous and careful, and within 3 months had become indispensable in the way genuinely good people tend to. Quietly, without requiring anyone to announce it. And I finished the maps. All of them. The full eastern boundary surveyed and drawn, and formally submitted to the Highland Cartographic Archive in the spring. My name was on the title page. I held the bound copy for a long time when it arrived. The valley I had grown up in, drawn where it actually was in ink that would outlast every person who had ever tried to move it. And my name, on the front, where anyone could see it. The girl in the gray dress had spent 23 years making sure her name was on nothing, making sure nothing could be traced back to her, making herself impossible to find. And here it was, on the front of a true map, impossible to miss. Alaric found me in the library that evening, with the copy still in my hands. He looked at it, at my name on the cover, at my hands holding it, at whatever was on my face that I wasn't managing as carefully as usual. And he said nothing, because he had learned the way I had learned about him, that some moments are not improved by words. He sat in the chair beside mine. He reached over and turned to the first map, the northeastern boundary, the valley, the one where the old survey had been most wrong. And he looked at it with the focused, genuine attention of a man who understood exactly what he was looking at. And we sat like that, for a long time, in the cedar-scented quiet, while the river ran outside and the city settled into its night. "The appeal is closed," he said eventually. "The grievance is gone. Your record is clean." A pause. "There's nothing keeping you here anymore." "I know," I said. "You could go back," he said, "to some version of a normal life." "I know that too." He turned in his chair to face me, and in the warm lamplight, he looked the way he had looked in the corridor all those weeks ago. Less sharp, the pale eyes less cool. Everything the daylight kept controlled, uncontrolled now. And what was in them was not the assessing expression I had catalogued over months of careful watching. It was something unguarded, something that had been waiting, patient and steady, for exactly this, for the moment when everything that needed resolving had resolved, and what remained was simply true. "Stay," he said. Not a command, not a negotiation. Something that had the texture of the most honest things. Offered without guarantee, without architecture, without anything around it except itself. And I thought about the girl who had pressed her spine against the stone, who had scrubbed wine from an apron at midnight with raw hands, who had built an entire life out of being quiet, quick, forgettable. I thought about Iselda standing up in a cold stone chamber and setting fire to 30 years of careful survival. For me. Because someone should have done it for her once. And no one did, and I understood, finally, the thing I had gotten wrong my entire life. Because I had always believed the reflex that made me step in front of that slap was a mistake. A failure of the invisibility I'd spent years perfecting. The one time my careful smallness had cracked and let the real thing through. Except it wasn't a failure. It wasn't a crack in the person I'd made myself. It was the person underneath. The one who had always been there. Watching from behind the gray dress. Reading every room, seeing every person no one else bothered to see. Waiting patiently for 23 years for a single moment when it would finally be safe enough to move. I had never needed to become someone new. I had only needed to stop hiding the one I already was. "All right," I said. It was not a fairy tale ending. I want to be honest about that, the way honesty had turned out to be the only currency that ever worked in that hall. The Western pressure took a full season to collapse. There were hard months. Iselda stayed through the winter and taught me without ceremony the way she taught everything, by treating me every single day as someone worth teaching. The last morning of that first year, I stood at the window of the room that had long since stopped feeling borrowed. And I looked out at the river below, silver in the early light, constant indifferent, and somehow because of that constancy, comforting. And I thought about the woman I'd been 12 months earlier, pressing herself flat against walls, cultivating invisibility, carrying plates through rooms full of people who were never meant to see her. She had not been wrong to survive the way she survived. The smallness had been a strategy, not a flaw. The invisibility had been a tool, not a destiny. But tools are for using. And the conditions had changed. I had changed them. With a reflex, with a forearm, with 8 words on a sealed letter, and a choice to walk toward them instead of away. Alaric appeared in the doorway behind me. I heard him before I saw him. The particular quality of his footsteps I now knew as well as my own, and he looked at me at the window and said nothing. And I turned and looked at him. And the morning light came through the glass and fell across the both of us. Warm, unhurried, like something that had decided to stay. That was enough. That was everything. That was how it ended. Not with a door closing, but with a morning beginning, and the quiet, certain knowledge that the girl who had spent her whole life making sure no one would ever see her had at last been seen, and had let herself be.